My husband pushed his chair back from the kitchen table and said it like he was discussing the weather. "You're old and sick, Margaret. I deserve to be happy." 48 years of marriage ended between the salt shaker and his untouched coffee. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't knock anything over or raise my voice or say a single word that I would later regret. I simply folded my napkin slowly, the way my mother taught me, corner to corner, and I placed it beside my plate. And then I looked at the man sitting across from me, really looked at him, the way you look at something when you are finally done pretending it is what it is not. What Gerald did not know, sitting there in that kitchen on that Tuesday morning, was that 2 years earlier, on another quiet morning, in another unremarkable moment, something had shifted in me, not dramatically, not with tears or arguments or slamming doors, just a small, clear shift. The kind that happens when a precise person finally decides to pay attention. And the folder sitting in my desk drawer upstairs, the one in the sewing room, the room he never entered, the room that had always, quietly, belonged only to me, that folder was thicker than he could imagine. I want to tell you how we got to that kitchen table. Because the real story didn't begin that morning. It began the morning I realized my husband had stopped seeing me, and I started seeing everything else. Before I go any further, I want to take a small moment. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've ever been dismissed, talked over, written off, treated like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected, then I think you already understand something about why I'm telling this story the way I'm going to tell it. I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and stay with me until the end. I promise it goes somewhere worth going. My name is Margaret. I am 73 years old. For 31 years, I taught 4th grade at the same elementary school, in the same district, in the same town where I raised my children and planted my garden and built the only life I have ever known. 4th grade was my year of choice, old enough to reason, young enough to still believe the world is basically fair. I loved those children. I loved that work. And I carried a certain precision into everything I did, because teaching requires it. You cannot be careless with a room full of 9-year-olds. You learn to notice things. You learn to document. You learn that the details others overlook are usually the ones that matter most. I am not a dramatic person. I am not someone who raises her voice in an argument or makes scenes in public or processes pain by breaking things. I am the kind of woman who keeps the warranty cards filed by appliance, who reads a contract before she signs it, who has used the same accountant, a man named Charles, for 22 years, because she believes in relationships built on trust and maintained through loyalty. People who knew me well would describe me as calm, careful, and occasionally too quiet for my own good. Gerald used to say that about me in the early years. He said it warmly then. I have managed a heart condition for 4 years. It is controlled, it is stable, it has never prevented me from walking, gardening, cooking, traveling, or living a full and capable life. I mention this because my husband began mentioning it constantly in ways I will come back to, and I want you to understand exactly what it was and was not before you hear how he used it. The betrayal hurt the way it did not because I was fragile. It hurt because I had given so much, for so long, with so much care. And because the man who delivered it did so with the casual confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome. He didn't think he needed to be careful. He didn't think I was watching, and those two assumptions, built slowly and quietly over the last years of our marriage, were the most expensive mistakes Gerald ever made. We married young. I was 25. He was 27. He was charming in that particular way some men are when they are young, and certain of themselves, a certainty that can look very much like strength until you've lived alongside it long enough to understand the difference. I was quieter, more careful, more inclined to read the fine print. We balanced each other in the beginning. That is the honest truth of it, and I won't rewrite history to make what came later feel inevitable. There were good years. There were very good years. I put my graduate school plans on hold when our first child came. I told myself I would return to finish the degree. I never did. That is not a complaint. It is simply a fact. One of the small invisible sacrifices that accumulate inside a long marriage like sediment, layer by layer, until they are simply part of the floor you walk on every day without thinking about what built it. Gerald lost his job in 1987. He lost it again in 2003. Both times, I managed the household budget in ways he never fully understood because he never had to look at the numbers with the same desperation I did. I picked up substitute teaching work. I stretched the grocery money. I renegotiated our insurance rates and paid the utilities in a specific order based on due dates I had memorized. Gerald said I was good at that kind of thing. He said it with appreciation in the early years. Later, I understood that he had simply filed it away as something I handled and moved on. When his mother became ill, this was 2011, she was 81, she could no longer manage her apartment alone. It was Margaret who suggested she come to live with us. And it was Margaret who bathed her and managed her medications and sat with her on the nights she was frightened and disoriented and held her hand through the last difficult months of her life. Gerald visited on weekends. He brought flowers. He called it supporting his mother. I called it what it was. I carried it. We bought the family home in 1989. I contributed a significant portion from my teaching salary and a modest inheritance from my father. The deed was structured in a particular way, both our names, a specific clause, a detail that seemed entirely unremarkable at the time. I will return to that detail. It is important. For 46 years, I believed this was a partnership. It took me 47 to start looking more carefully. The changes didn't announce themselves. They arrived the way coal does in autumn, gradually, incrementally, in ways you keep explaining away until the temperature has dropped so much you can no longer pretend it is still warm. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Gerald had never been private with his phone. For decades, it sat on the kitchen counter or the coffee table or the arm of his chair, open and unguarded. The way people behave when they have nothing to conceal. Then, sometime, in what I now understand, was approximately 2.5 years before that kitchen table morning, it changed. He began carrying it to other rooms, charging it face down on the nightstand, taking it to the bathroom. It was such a small thing, the kind of thing you could spend a long time telling yourself meant nothing. I noticed it. I said nothing. Then the clothes. Gerald had dressed the same way for 20 years. Practical shirts, khakis, comfortable shoes. The wardrobe of a man who had stopped thinking about what impression he made. But new things began appearing in the closet. Younger looking things. Things that hadn't been discussed, hadn't been mentioned, hadn't arrived in a shopping bag left on the kitchen table the way purchasers always used to. They simply appeared. I noticed. I said nothing. Then The money. I had always managed our shared checking account. This was simply how our household had been organized from the beginning. I knew our patterns. I knew what came in and what went out, and roughly when and why. And I began noticing small, regular withdrawals I could not account for. Not large, not alarming in isolation, but consistent. The same rhythm, month after month. I bought a small notebook. I began writing down the dates and amounts. The dinner conversations disappeared more slowly than the rest. Gerald had always talked about his opinions, his observations, the news, the neighbours, what he'd read. Gradually, over the course of perhaps a year, the conversations narrowed. They became logistical. What was in the refrigerator? Whether the car needed servicing? What time a grandchild's birthday party started? The warmth had been replaced with what I can only describe as efficient tolerance, like a business relationship conducted in a kitchen. And then there were the health comments. This is the one I want to describe with the most precision, because it was this particular pattern that first made me understand that something was being constructed. Gerald began mentioning my heart condition in conversations with other people at family dinners. In phone calls, I could partially hear from another room in ways that were slightly carefully exaggerated. Margaret tires easily. She's not really up to travel anymore. You have to be patient with her. None of it was entirely untrue. None of it was entirely accurate. It was the language of someone building a narrative. I noticed. I said nothing. But I filed it away in the same part of my mind where I kept the notebook entries and the phone behavior and the new clothes. I didn't know yet what picture these pieces would form. I only knew that a precise woman keeps records of things that don't add up. The dinner is the moment I return to most often when I think about the sharp edge of what was happening. Our youngest son hosted a family gathering a Sunday afternoon. Everyone there, grandchildren running through the backyard, the comfortable noise of a large family in a warm house. I was feeling well that day. I was talking, laughing, fully present. At some point during the meal, I mentioned something incorrectly, a small detail about a trip we had taken 3 years earlier, some minor geographical mix-up that meant nothing. Gerald looked at me across the table and said, easily, with what looked from a distance like gentle concern, "She forgets things now. It's the age and the medication." The table moved on. No one challenged it. My daughter-in-law, our son's wife, gave me a look from across the table. Just a look. I filed it away. It was a small cruelty delivered in public with the plausible dressing of worry. And it told me something important. Gerald was narrating me to my own family. He was building a version of Margaret, diminished, confused, unreliable, that would make a certain future easier to explain. 2 weeks after that dinner, he told me there was a meeting with his financial advisor that I didn't need to attend. "It's complex," he said. "There's a lot to go through. I'll explain it to you after." He always said that. And there had never been an after. I had managed our finances. I had read every document this household had ever signed. The deliberate exclusion of me from a financial meeting framed as protection landed differently than anything else had. It had the specific chill of intention. That evening, I called Charles. I did not tell him everything. I simply asked a few questions. And Charles, who has known both of us for 22 years and is a careful man, asked me one question in return. He asked whether I had reviewed the beneficiary designations on our life insurance policies recently. He asked it carefully, professionally, the way a person asks when they already suspect the answer will be uncomfortable. I told him I would look into it. I went to the filing cabinet that evening, the same filing cabinet I have maintained for 30 years. I found the policy file, I opened it, I read it. The beneficiary designation on our primary policy, a substantial policy Gerald and I had taken out together in 2001, had been changed. Not recently enough to look sudden. Changed approximately 14 months earlier. The new beneficiary was not me. It was a name I did not recognize, routed through a financial account I had never seen. I sat with that piece of paper for a long time. I did not call Gerald into the room. I photographed the document with my phone, clearly and carefully. I returned the file to the cabinet exactly as I had found it. I walked to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table, the same table where, more than a year later, Gerald would tell me I was old and sick, and I allowed myself to understand what I was looking at. This was not a marriage going cold. This was a marriage being dismantled, deliberately, quietly, by someone who had concluded, without ever checking, that I would not look. The next morning, I called Charles back. "I found something," I said. "I need to understand what it means, and I need to understand what I should do." What followed was the most clarifying period of my adult life. I did not change my behavior in any way Gerald would notice. I continued making dinner, attending church, visiting grandchildren. I was warm and unremarkable and entirely ordinary, the version of myself that Gerald had already stopped seeing. And that invisibility, I came to understand, was my single greatest advantage. I started going through the mail before Gerald saw it. I had always collected it. That was simply our arrangement. But now I read everything carefully. I found statements for a financial account at an institution I didn't recognize. The account was in Gerald's name only. I photographed each statement as it arrived and returned it to the pile without comment. I found the original house deed in the filing cabinet and read it with new eyes. Both names. A specific clause we had insisted on in 1989, a detail a family attorney had recommended, which Gerald and I had agreed to without much discussion and then entirely forgotten. I called Charles. He walked me through what it meant. I wrote it down and placed the copy in a folder I had begun keeping in the bottom drawer of my desk in the sewing room. One evening, Gerald was in the study with the door partially open. I heard him on the phone. I heard him say a name, Diane, and then I heard, "Soon," and "She won't fight it," and "She doesn't understand how any of this works," and then a soft laugh. I stood in the hallway and I heard that laugh, and I felt something change in my chest. Not grief, exactly, something cooler and more durable than grief. Something that felt like the closing of a door that had been slowly swinging shut for a long time. I went to the sewing room. I added a note to the folder. The folder was growing steadily thicker. Charles referred me to a woman named Patricia, a family law and estate attorney with 30 years of experience. I made the appointment myself, paid for it from my personal savings account, and told no one. I brought the folder to that meeting, all of it. The insurance document, the account statements, the deed, the notebook with dates and amounts, the note about the phone call. Patricia reviewed everything without hurry. She asked careful questions. I answered them. She told me that the beneficiary change was legal but potentially contestable given the timing and the pattern of financial behavior surrounding it. She told me that in our state, funds accumulated during a marriage are considered marital assets, regardless of whose name the account is under, and that the deposits in Gerald's private account, cross-referenced against withdrawals from our joint account, showed a clear and documentable pattern of transfer during the marriage. She flagged this in her notes with particular attention. It would matter in court. Then she looked at the deed. She read the clause slowly. She set the document down. She told me that the house Gerald expected to sell or claim as a primary asset in any divorce proceeding, could not be sold, refinanced, or transferred without my explicit, notarized consent. Not because of anything I had recently done, because of a clause two careful people had signed in 1989 and then forgotten, and because my name was on that deed just as firmly as his. If he files for divorce expecting to control this property, Patricia said, he will be making a significant legal miscalculation. I drove home from that meeting feeling something I had not felt in 2 years. Orientation. A clear understanding of where I stood and where the boundaries were. In the weeks that followed, Patricia and Charles helped me reconstruct the full financial picture of the marriage. What emerged was something Gerald had clearly never bothered to calculate because he had never imagined I would. The house was the largest single marital asset. It was mine to protect. Gerald's private account contained funds that were legally marital property. My share of his pension and retirement accounts under state law was substantial. The inheritance from my father, placed in a separate account at the time and structured correctly by a meticulous family attorney, could not be touched. And Gerald's own life insurance policy, the one listing his named beneficiary, still listed me. He had not changed it. Either he forgot, or he assumed it didn't matter, or he simply never thought I would look closely enough to find it. Let him file, Patricia said when I asked her what we should do. The filing will be the beginning, not the end. Let him come to the table believing he controls it. Then we respond. Patience, she told me, was the strategy. As it turned out, patience was the one thing I had always been better at than my husband. I watched Gerald, in those final months, move through our house with the quiet confidence of a man who believed everything was already decided. He became slightly warmer with me, not from genuine feeling, I understood now, but because Patricia had warned me this sometimes happened near the end. They want the separation to look amicable, she had said. They want to be able to say you were treated kindly. I received his warmth with the same quiet smile I had always offered. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I gave him nothing that would suggest I had spent the past 2 years becoming very precisely informed about everything he thought he had moved beyond my reach. He had a meeting with his financial advisor in October, another in November. I knew from the calendar, from the mail, from the fragments of phone calls I overheard. There was talk of a timeline. There was talk of the first of the year. In December, a receipt came to the house. A jewelry store. Gerald had been careless, the kind of carelessness that comes from believing you are untouchable. I photographed it. It went in the folder. The folder was now very thick. Our youngest son called me in January, slightly uncomfortable, clearly not certain what he was walking into. He told me his father had said there might be changes coming, that he'd been thinking about the future. Our son didn't know what to say. He was trying, in his way, to prepare me. I thanked him gently. I told him I loved him. I said nothing about the folder. 3 weeks later, Gerald sat down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and said the words, "You're old and sick, Margaret. I deserve to be happy. I folded my napkin. I placed it beside my plate. I looked at him and said very quietly, "I know, Gerald." Then I excused myself from the table. That afternoon, I called Patricia. "He said it," I told her. "What happens next?" "Now," she said, "we wait for him to file." He filed 6 weeks later. His attorney submitted a petition that claimed the house should be sold with proceeds divided, that certain retirement accounts were primarily his contribution, and that given Margaret's health, a modest monthly support arrangement would be appropriate and generous. It was, Patricia noted when she reviewed it, exactly what we expected. His attorney had built a careful-looking case around a set of assumptions that were, in several legally significant ways, entirely wrong. Patricia filed our response. I will not walk you through every document, every deposition, every exchange of correspondence. What I will tell you is that Gerald's attorney, who had come into this process with considerable confidence, became progressively quieter as discovery continued and the full picture of the marital estate, the actual picture, not the one Gerald had described, became clear. There was one moment I want to describe specifically. It was a formal mediation session, a conference room. Gerald and his attorney on one side of the table, Patricia and I on the other. Gerald was wearing one of the new shirts I had noticed appearing in the closet 18 months earlier. He sat the way he had always sat when he believed a situation was already settled, leaned back slightly, arms folded loosely, the posture of a man who is waiting for the formality to finish. His attorney presented a revised proposal. It was more generous than the original filing. Gerald had clearly been advised to move towards something that looked reasonable. Patricia listened to the entire proposal without expression. When it was finished, she opened her folder and placed a single document on the center of the table. It was a summary, a clean, clear accounting of the deposits into Gerald's private account, cross-referenced with withdrawals from our joint account across 22 months, totaling a specific and substantial figure. Patricia did not give a speech. She simply said, "Before we respond to the revised proposal, we'd like to discuss this." Gerald looked at the document. I watched him look at it. I had waited a long time for that moment, and I found, when it arrived, that it was quieter than I had imagined. He didn't rage. He didn't deny. He went very still. His attorney asked for a 10-minute break. I sat in that conference room while they were gone, and I looked at the window, and I thought about the folder in the sewing room. About the Tuesday morning, 2 years earlier, when I had first opened that filing cabinet with new eyes, about every entry in the small notebook, about Charles asking me carefully whether I had reviewed the beneficiary designations recently, about Patricia telling me to be patient. The door opened. They came back. The final settlement was reached 2 weeks later. I kept the house. I received my full legal share of Gerald's retirement accounts. The private account was disclosed, evaluated, and divided as marital property. The support arrangement was structured fairly, documented properly, and made permanent. Gerald received what the law entitled him to, not what he had planned to take. There is a difference, and the difference was significant. I did not humiliate him. I did not need to. The paperwork did it quietly, the way paperwork always does, without raising its voice. Gerald moved in with Diane 3 weeks after the settlement. They are together, as far as I know. I have not spoken to him since the mediation session. I do not expect to. I hold no particular act of anger toward him anymore, not because I have forgiven easily, but because anger at Gerald would require me to remain oriented around Gerald. I have chosen to orient myself around my own life, around what remains, around what was always mine. My eldest daughter called the day after the settlement and cried, not for the divorce, but for not asking more questions, for the dinner table and staying quiet. You didn't need to apologize, I told her, but I was glad you did. My son, who had always admired his father's particular kind of confidence, struggled with what the documents represented. It took him months. He came on a Sunday afternoon eventually and sat at the kitchen table, and we drank coffee and talked for 3 hours. I did not ask him to choose. I simply told him the truth, the way I had always believed truth should be told, plainly, without performance, without manipulation. The house is quieter than it used to be. I have learned slowly that quiet is not the same as empty. I repainted the sewing room, the room where the folder lived for 2 years. I had it done in a warm colour I had always wanted, and Gerald had always vetoed without explanation. I put a small reading chair in the corner. I bought a good lamp. I sit there in the evenings sometimes, and I read, and I listen to the house settle around me, and I feel something I am still learning to name. I am seeing a therapist. I began 6 months after the settlement because I believe that surviving something cleanly does not mean processing it alone. She is a calm and precise woman, which suits me. We are making progress. I still sit at the kitchen table in the mornings. I drink my coffee. I look at the place across from me and I feel I want to be honest about this, something that is not quite grief and not quite relief, but lives in the space between them. I am learning to sit with it without needing it to resolve into something simpler than it is. Here is what I want to say. To anyone listening who has been told in words or in silence or in the slow accumulation of 100 small dismissals that they are finished, that they are past the point of mattering, that they are old or tired or too compromised to be worth accounting for. I learned that silence, chosen deliberately and used with precision, can be the most powerful form of speech available to you. I chose silence because I needed time, and time turned out to be the one resource my husband could not buy, borrow, or quietly transfer into a private account. I learned that being underestimated is a peculiar kind of gift. When someone stops taking you seriously, they stop watching you carefully. And when they stop watching you carefully, you can see everything. Gerald stopped seeing me long before he sat down at that table. He had decided what I was and stopped looking. That was never my diminishment. It was his error. I learned that dignity is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is what you do with your hands when your heart is breaking. It is the choice made in the space between one breath and the next, between the insult and the response to remain yourself. I folded a napkin. It was all I did in that moment. And it was enough. And if I were to say anything to someone sitting where I was sitting 2.5 years ago, noticing small things, writing down dates, making phone calls in private, not yet certain what picture the pieces would form, I would say this: pay attention. Keep records. Find people you trust and trust them with the truth. Do not let anyone, not even someone who has shared your table for 48 years, convince you that you don't understand how things work. You understand more than they think. You always have. I am 73 years old. I tend my garden in the mornings. I walk in the afternoons. I sit in my warm-coloured room with my good lamp, and I read books I choose for myself. I have a house that belongs to me, a name that means what it always meant, and a life that is, finally and entirely, my own to arrange. I am not old in the way Gerald meant the word. I am not finished. I am not diminished. And I have never, not once, not for a single morning of my life, been as invisible as my husband believed.